So this is Mrs. Hale coming at you to pick up basically where we had left off in class talking about President Truman's foreign policy. So as a reminder, Truman and Stalin's relationship basically broke apart after the end of World War II. And as a reminder, we also see Germany divided into four parts. And what you are looking at right now is the Berlin airlift. So what ends up happening is in 1948, the United States, France, and Great Britain decide to merge their three occupied areas of Berlin into one, known as West Berlin. And this doesn't sit well with Stalin, and he reacts by cutting off highway and railroad traffic, essentially leaving 2.2 million people cut off from the Allied nations. So what the United States does is Truman is determined to stand up to Joseph Stalin, and the United States begins to airlift supplies into Berlin, West Berlin. So lasting for 10 months, we fly 4,600 tons of supplies in a single day, but we are sure that it's really not enough. So we began to increase it. And in the height of the airlift in April of 1949, nearly 1,400 flights land about 13,000 supplies in one single day. Now, what is the urgency behind it is the fact that the people in West Berlin only had coal to last them for 45 days and enough food for 36 days. So there was that sense of urgency to get people their needed supplies. You have in this image here, the candy bomber. No, his real name is Gale Halverson, and he earned that nickname because he would drop candy via mini parachutes over Berlin, and we ended up dropping over 23 tons of candy throughout the airlift. And Gale Halverson became the hero to the citizens of Berlin, especially the children, to get such a sweet treat. This lasted for 327 days, and we dropped 2.3 million tons of food and supplies. What's really the consequence of the Berlin airlift, because Stalin eventually lifted it in May of 1949, we're going to see an increased rivalry, and Stalin kind of digging in the fact that he didn't manage to starve the Allies out of Berlin. So we pick up with an arms race, and this is when we discover that the Soviet Union has tested an atomic bomb. Now, Truman had been told that the Soviets would not be able to detonate an atomic bomb for about 5 to 10 years, and lo and behold, they get it pretty quickly. So you have National Security Council NSC-68, which was created by the Department of State and the Department of Defense. And what they suggested to Truman was that we should rebuild our conventional military forces and nuclear weapons. And so we start to also build up for the US hydrogen bomb. NSC-68 did reject the alternative policies that we had kind of had a friendly detente and containment of the Soviet Union. We end up getting the atomic bomb, and about a couple years after us, the Soviet Union ends up testing the Soviet bomb as well. And this all leads to heightened fear of what are the Soviets doing, because we see that China falls to communism. And we also see that there's a threat in French Indochina, as it's called, or modern day Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Now, keep in mind, China fell to communism, and the US did not recognize Mao Zedong as the leader of the People's Republic of China. And still, we were supporting Chiang Kai-shek, who was trying to hold on to power from Taiwan. For the Korean War, I'm going to go through this briefly, but I just want to show you this quick little timeline here of the Korean War, of how it progresses in 1950 to 1951, and then basically stalls out at this 38th parallel line, the horizontal line that you see on the screen. So I'm not going to play it 2 times through. I'll just play it the one time, but you'll realize that mid 1951, late 1951, the sides don't change at all. So let's talk about as to why and what happened when the Cold War finally turns hot. So the origins of the Korean War, excuse me, go back to basically Japan and France. Okay, Japan had ruled Korea during World War II. And with the vacuum that was created when Japan left, the Soviet Union steps in particular starts to support a government in North Korea that would be communist. What the US does then is we start to establish free elections in South Korea. So the elections were supposed to take place in 1949, but the communists refused to participate in the elections. So by default, to the south, Syngman Rhee is elected as president of South Korea, and his nation is recognized legitimate by the US and 30 other countries. However, Kim Il-sung takes control of North Korea and establishes a communist government supported eventually by China and the Soviet Union there. In June of 1950, a civil war erupts in Korea when North Korea attacks South Korea. To give you a quick timeout to show you, because there's a bit of fascination with the Kim family, Kim Il-sung is known as the founder of North Korea, the great leader and eternal president. When he died, his son Kim Jong-il took over, and he was known as the dear leader. And now his son, Kim Jong-un, is the current supreme leader of North Korea. With the Korean War, there is question as far as should we call it the Korean War or a UN police action? And the reason is because of how the UN handled it. So keep in mind, the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members, and in order from left to right using modern day flags, you have China, you have Russia, you have France, US, and Great Britain. And then you have 10 non-permanent members who rotate in and out. So what ends up happening is Russia walks out of a special session of the UN Security Council. And the way we take him walking out is that he forfeits his veto concerning going to war or not. So unanimously, the Security Council votes on going to war. What then happens is within days, the US sends troops to South Korea, and it is going to be led by General Douglas MacArthur, who had been in the Philippines like during World War II, I shall return. So what ends up happening, though, is that the troops that fight are supposed to be both US and United Nations troops. It is important to note that President Truman fought under the United Nations, and so he never asked Congress for a true declaration of war. So as you kind of look at these different phases, I'll just kind of talk about the problems within the United Nations contingent of military. First off, United Nations, there was no common language for the soldiers. Some of their equipment was obsolete or did not really match with each other's nations. They also had different techniques and tactics to fight. And no real training facilities were established, and they were outnumbered by the North Korean troops. A big problem is that they didn't really have a unified goal. Are we stopping communism from spreading into South Korea? Are we stopping communism from spreading like the entire peninsula? Are we trying to eradicate communism in the Korean peninsula? Like, what is our true goal here is going to be part of the problem. So what you are noticing is that right away, North Korea just pushes the South Koreans back to the city in the south of Busan. And launching a counteroffensive in September of 1950, North Korea is pushed back all the way to nearly the Yalu River, okay? And they manage to, South Korea manages to encircle this North Korean troops. Now, the problem is going to be then is what happens with Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur wants to actually go across the Yalu River and into China. And President Truman says, absolutely not, because that would awaken the beast of China. And we were not ready to fight with our, if you will, an ally from World War II in that regard. And so eventually North Korea rallies back and pushes essentially to what we now know as the DMZ, the demilitarized zone of the 38th parallel line. So just real quick, what I mentioned previously, MacArthur had publicly questioned Truman, saying that we must win and there is no substitute victory for victory, and that we have to keep pushing the North Koreans all the way back. This is when I mentioned Truman removes MacArthur from his command. It was a horrible PR moment for Truman because MacArthur had been so well loved. And so Truman, though his main concern was we need to save as many lives as possible, even if that means signing a ceasefire at that 38th parallel line. And MacArthur didn't agree with this. And so MacArthur tried to thwart Truman's attempts to negotiate a ceasefire. And eventually in April of 1951, Truman officially relieves MacArthur from his command. And this is when you then have MacArthur leaving and saying that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Now, Omar Bradley, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, agreed with Truman, saying that in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the strategy of MacArthur's, meaning expanding the war, would involve us in the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong enemy. And so, although PR-wise, Truman did take a hit, he did have the support of fellow military members. So eventually an armistice was signed in July of 1953. And technically this armistice was signed under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, but I just wanted you to realize that the war itself had basically been over for over a year. It's just that we were waiting on that official signing of the armistice line for the border of the 38th parallel line. So what is the result of this? Well, first off, the number of troops that died in the war and were injured or missing in action. You also have the dollar cost of it all. But keep in mind, I'd say it's more about the overall impact of the Korean War. That Korea to this day, you guys know, is divided, and that both sides are going to brutally suppress political opposition at home. And both sides will have rigid control over the lives and liberties of the people there. So the reality is, even though, if you will, we kind of contained communism, it's going to be a loss for true democratic principles. So under Eisenhower, when he comes into office after Truman leaves, you have this brinkmanship policy, which is Secretary of State John Dulles' idea. And it's to use nuclear weapons and be willing to go to that brink of war. It's about this threat, okay? And the reason why is because of MAD, our mutually assured destruction. By this point, when Eisenhower comes into office, both the Soviet Union and the US have various nuclear weapons. And we know that we could annihilate each other relatively easily. And so under Eisenhower, we see this change into a domino theory that we want to try to prevent one country from falling to communism in order to prevent the spread of communism. And that's like the image you see up there where each country is a different domino. Now, what Eisenhower does begin to do is use the CIA, which had been created under President Truman, and he uses covert operations. Because it doesn't involve US troops and it's way less expensive. So he goes into 1953 and with the CIA helps create a coup in Iran. Then also in 1954, goes into Guatemala with the CIA and covert operations. Unfortunately, both locations, it ends up pushing an anti-American feeling in Latin America and in Iran. So just to realize, I'm not going to go all the way into the Vietnam War, but I just want you to realize how long the Vietnam War actually goes on. In 1954, the US starts to see problems in Vietnam because of the French wanting to maintain control up here in the north, like where it says Dien Bien Phu. And of course, France being our ally kind of calls on us to offer some support. So realize that this is going on under Eisenhower. The Vietnam War goes Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, and all the way through Nixon. So 4 US presidents, okay? So where it really picks up with for President Eisenhower is that we do see this domino theory coming true, that one nation is falling to communism, North Korea, and now we're seeing North Vietnam, and we're worried about more from there, okay? So you'll understand more about Ho Chi Minh for the North and No Dinh Diem for the South based on your homework that you're doing. So in the Middle East, you have a couple different problems going on. First off, in the grand scheme of things, OPEC is going to be created. OPEC is your oil cartel in the Middle East that is still around today, dominating our oil industry. What you have going on, though, with relationship to problems is that Israel was created in 1948. And ever since its creation in 1948, there have been a series of wars that Israel has fought against its neighbors in order to basically defend its borders, maybe take more land, and try to establish their presence in this Middle East area. So there's going to be the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. So the Suez Canal over here had been built by the British and run by the British since colonization time. And what the Egypt leader, Nasser, wants to do is nationalize it. And so what he does is he basically dams off the Lake Nasser, and creates the Aswan Dam. And by creating the Aswan Dam, he is then able to offer or to collect payment for anyone using the Nile River, just like you pay a toll tax or whatever when you're driving on a road. Same type of idea, in order to gain money, because he wasn't allowed to nationalize the Suez Canal. So what eventually happens, though, is that because of the Suez crisis and taking advantage of problems, Israel launches an attack into Egypt over the Sinai Peninsula. Immediately with that attack, Great Britain and France aid Israel. And the question is, was that prearranged or not? Either way, what ends up happening is tempers began to cool, and eventually the Suez Canal is turned over to the Egyptians. What this then prompts is the Eisenhower Doctrine, that areas can request US economic aid and or military forces if you're being threatened by armed aggression from another state, okay? And you end up seeing this kind of your extension of your ideas from the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, that type of stuff. You also have, under President Eisenhower, a new leader in the Soviet Union. You have Joseph Stalin dies in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev, who you see in the middle there, takes over for power. Originally, Khrushchev and Eisenhower don't see eye to eye, especially as Eisenhower proposes this plan called Open Skies. And the proposal was that the US and Soviet Union would end up exchanging maps to indicate the location of military installations across the world. And then each country could kind of do their own aerial reconnaissance and see what's going on. Basically, the Soviets reject that idea and laugh in our face over it. And Khrushchev declares that Open Skies was nothing more than an espionage plot. And Eisenhower later says it actually wasn't meant to be an espionage plot. He knew, though, that the Russians would never accept the plan, but thought that if they rejected an idea, that it would be poor performance on the Soviet part, and it would make the US look a lot better. So what ends up happening is in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev then proposes what's going to be called a peaceful coexistence theory, trying to open up economic trade between the United States and other capitalist allies and the Soviet Union in particular, to try to drum up some of that economic support. Now, everyone understands that socialism and capitalism can't see eye to eye, but it was about trying to open up the relations between everyone. But then in October of 1956, you have the Hungarian Revolt. And this was the first time that one of the Soviet Union's nations, if you will, was trying to revolt against Moscow. And the Soviet Union brutally suppressed the Hungarian Revolution. And then you have in 1957, the Russian satellite Sputnik was launched into space. And what it did was it really instilled this fear into Americans, and the fact that instilled this idea that we had fallen behind on the space race with science and technology. And so we see a National Defense and Education Act passed by Congress. And this is it's your STEM, okay, to increase science, technology, education, math, all in schools, okay, to really kind of pick it up for our country. And then we also see NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, formed. Under President Eisenhower, we do see issues with Cuba flare up. Castro gains power in 1959 when he overthrows a corrupt dictator. And we actually at first welcomed Castro, thinking that maybe we could get him to side to the United States and democracy. Now, keep in mind, the US has this weird history with Cuba, where in like the 1850s, the southern states wanted Cuba for slavery and for plantations. And then in 1898, we helped with the Spanish-American War, then revolt against Spanish rule. And so now we had hoped that Cuba would turn towards democracy, but instead, when Castro seized power, he aligned himself with the Soviet Union. You then add on top of that, in May of 1960, there was an American U-2 spy plane that was shot down by the Soviets. And it turned out to be a single-seat aircraft flown by a CIA pilot, Francis Gary Powers. He managed to eject, parachute safely to the ground, but then he was captured by the Soviet forces. At first, the US tried to play it off that he was doing weather research. It was NASA, had flown off course, but then eventually, like, the true purpose came out when the Soviet government was like, dude, time out. We have your pilot and we have all of his equipment, okay, for surveillance. So then it all happens 2 weeks before there was supposed to be like an East meets West summit in Paris. And it just strains and deteriorates the relations with the United States and Soviet Union. So Powers is going to be convicted of espionage and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment plus 7 years of hard labor, but was released 2 years later in 1962 on a prisoner exchange. So when Kennedy comes into office, just realize that some of his programs are going to be aimed towards foreign policies. For example, the creation of the Peace Corps to try to spread humanitarian and education and economic aid around the world, and it's still in effect today. The Alliance for Progress was trying to help out in Latin America, providing for equitable income distribution, land reform, economic development, that type of idea, trying to promote the ideas there. And then in 1962, you have the Trade Expansion Act, and it was basically calling on and reducing your tariff rates within Europe. In part of his plan, though, JFK calls for what's going to be called a flexible response. Use conventional and non-nuclear weapons, but also mobilize your military forces. We see the use of Green Berets. We see JFK bringing troops into the Congo, Laos, and Vietnam as well. But basically trying to use money as well as maybe some, more traditional methods as opposed to CIA covert operations and other means of that nature. So the Bay of Pigs invasion is actually something that JFK inherited from Eisenhower. And under Eisenhower, the CIA began training Cuban rebels who would then go ashore in Cuba and help cause a revolt against Castro. However, the day comes in 1961 when our CIA trained Cubans landed at the Bay of Pigs, but they didn't end up setting off an uprising because they got trapped on the beach and surrendered. Why? Well, no US forces were sent in to rescue them. So with this failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro got more aid from the Soviet Union, but it's definitely one of those examples of like when one president inherits another idea from the previous president and you roll with it, that type of thing. It came down to Kennedy. He went ahead with the program and he had to accept responsibility for the failure of it, which he did. Then you also have the Berlin Wall being built. So the Berlin Wall was built because basically Stalin threw down an ultimatum: pull out your US troops from Berlin or else. And the or else was to build a wall. So 15 feet tall, 103 miles all along West Berlin, specifically 28 miles dividing East and West Berlin. You then have the Berlin Wall built, and it doesn't come down until 1989, 1991 or so. Cuba is not over. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, and this is probably the most heightened time that we see between the US and Soviet Union, where tensions really had amounted. So what ends up happening is the Soviets had started to build missile launch pads in Cuba, and their equipment was being phased towards the United States. As a reminder, like, the US and Cuba, from the northernmost point of Cuba and southernmost point of US, it's about 90 miles away. So there's this fear in the country of nuclear warfare, of being bombed, of being missile attacked, okay? And so JFK establishes a naval blockade of Cuba until the weapons are removed. And through this heightened tension, Nikita Khrushchev does back down, and JFK promises to remove missiles that we also had in Turkey. So this kind of image here shows you how heightened, like, the fears and tensions were, that everyone's sitting on these bombs and are we going to go off or not? We do eventually sign under JFK the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and 100+ nations signed, saying that we would end testing in the atmosphere. As you know, JFK does get assassinated November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. We'll talk more about this on the domestic side of things, but just realize that this throws a shift as we then see LBJ come into office. So the last little bit that I want to end you with is that when LBJ comes into office, this whole idea of containment and the different programs we have, in some areas it's really helped, and in some areas it hasn't. So I just want to show you kind of like your big world map here of what's been going on, where the Cold War has turned hot. Have we succeeded or have we failed in certain areas? What will be up next for you is talking about the Vietnam War. Talk to you later.